Welcome to Case by Case. We want to just take a moment and remind you that this content is intended for adult audiences. It is created for educational and informational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as discussions may include references to real criminal cases, violence, and other sensitive and potentially distressing topics. While we strive to present every case with accuracy and respect those involved, the material may not be suitable for all viewers. Please proceed thoughtfully. And remember, if you need to take a step back, if you find something that concerns you, if you find it to be triggering and you need to take a step back, please do. You can join us whenever you're ready to come back. We'll leave the light on. Welcome to Case by Case. I'm Terry, and today we're going to talk about the Nancy Guthrie case and what has unfolded so far. We're about 6 weeks into the investigation, 6 weeks since she went missing, which is honestly hard to believe. When this case first broke, I think most people assumed it would be resolved much sooner. After all, we're talking about an 84-year-old woman. It's a low-risk victim. The first question everyone asked was, how far could she have gone? And the second question was, how far could someone realistically take her without being noticed? Most people believed that by now she would have been found. I'm one of those. Even if the outcome had been tragic, many expected that investigators would have located her by this point, but that hasn't happened. And that's in spite of a number of efforts by the family, by law enforcement, and by countless online sleuths who've been following the case from the beginning. So I want to break down what has happened week by week, leading us to where we are now. Now, I'm not going to cover every single detail because a lot has happened in 6 weeks, and quite frankly, I can't keep up with all of it. Instead, we're going to focus on what I consider the key events and the things that really shaped the direction of the investigation. The first week she disappeared. Nancy Guthrie was last seen January 31st at her home. Later that evening, she'd been visiting her daughter and son-in-law. At some point later that night, they brought her home. Some reports say they simply dropped her off, while others suggest they may have walked her inside. That detail isn't really clear, but what we do know is that she arrived home safely that evening from everything we've been told. Now, there are a few very important things to understand about Nancy's health and mobility before we go any further. First of all, her mobility was limited. Early reporting indicated that she needed assistance walking more than 50 yards, but later that description appeared to change to 50 feet. Now that's a very big difference. 50 yards is roughly half a football field. That's a fair distance, but still manageable for most people. But 50 feet is a completely different animal altogether. 50 feet could simply mean getting from one side of a room to another, depending on the size of the home. So, regardless of which measurement is correct, what we know is that walking significant distances would be difficult for her, and she often needed assistance. Another vitally important detail is that Nancy had significant hearing loss and wore hearing aids. That matters because people generally remove their hearing aids at night before going to sleep. Anyone who's had family members, I have, with hearing aids knows this is standard practice. So if Nancy removed her hearing aids before going to bed and someone entered her home during the night, even if they made a normal amount of noise, there's a very real possibility she would not have heard them unless she happened to already be awake. And perhaps she had been awake. Maybe she was reading, watching TV, or just unable to sleep. I know the older I get, the more my insomnia rears its ugly head, and I've always been a person that loved my sleep. So it does happen. And we don't know what she was doing. But what we do know is that whatever happened occurred in the middle of the night. Another major factor in Nancy's health is that she had a pacemaker, and the pacemaker was connected to an app on her phone. That app monitored the pacemaker and transmitted readings. Presumably, those readings would go to her doctors or medical providers, because otherwise, what point would there be in having the device connected? At some point during the night, that connection stopped transmitting data. That moment in time is incredibly important in the investigation. Technology like that can sometimes help investigators narrow down a timeline, and in this case, it may represent the moment when something went tragically wrong. Now, Nancy was reported missing the next day, February 1st, around noon, when family members were unable to reach her. What triggered that concern was actually part of her normal Sunday routine. See, Nancy regularly attended an online church service every Sunday morning, and she got together with a group of people and they watched it on television or on a computer. I'm not sure which. Because of her age and mobility issues, she didn't physically attend the church, and it was in New York. So she would go to a friend's home to watch, and sometimes they would come to her. And she joined an online service. Reportedly, the church that her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, the well-known journalist from the Today Show, which is what made this show so unique and high profile, it reportedly is from the church that she attended. So she would get together and watch with friends. But this was something she did regularly every Sunday. So when Nancy failed to show for that service, her friends became concerned and they contacted local family. Family notified law enforcement, and when police arrived, several alarming things were discovered. First, the doorbell camera had been removed. Second, investigators found drops of blood on the porch, and they noted there was also signs of a struggle. Later, investigators were able to recover the video footage showing a masked man standing on the front porch with a gun. A lot has been said about the masked man, what he wore, what gloves he wore, what he did, and the strange way he was carrying his gun. He was wearing dark clothing and carrying a black Ozark Trail backpack, which many people have traced back to a brand commonly sold at Walmart for around $10. Investigators estimated the suspect's height to be between 5'9" and 5'10", but this information did not come out immediately. One of the reasons for the delay is that the camera system was not properly syncing to the cloud. Apparently, you had to have a subscription. I know on our cameras, you do have to have an active subscription for them to sync up to the cloud service that's provided by the company manufacturer of your camera system. So it wasn't syncing to the cloud, and the investigators had to work with technology companies, I think it was Google or Amazon, to retrieve the footage directly from the servers. Another key piece of information investigators released was the timing of the pacemaker signal. The pacemaker app stopped transmitting data at approximately 2:28 a.m. This moment could represent a crucial turning point in the timeline because, think about it, it can indicate that this is the moment Nancy's phone was separated from her, because they did find it left behind. And this could indicate that something happened that interrupted that device's communication. Was this when she was maybe removed from the home? One investigator realized they were dealing with a potential abduction, and there was a massive law enforcement response. The home was initially treated as a crime scene, then briefly released, and later treated as a crime scene again, and only recently has been released again to the family. But this initial releasing it and then going back again is something that has generated a great deal of criticism from mainly retired detectives and investigators who've been analyzing the case online. Now, a lot of those investigators have a lot of knowledge about cases like this because they were in homicide divisions for 20-something years. Authorities conducted a neighborhood canvass, and they talked to residents, and they were looking for other surveillance footage. Eventually, at some point, the FBI joined the investigation. As the case gained attention, the media coverage exploded, and Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, again the host of the Today Show, issued a public appeal outside alongside with her brother and sister. I'm sorry. She did do one outside of the family by herself later, but this first one included her brother and her sister. Savannah was the one who spoke the most during that statement, which really makes sense because she works in television and she's accustomed to speaking publicly on camera. But it was clear from that message that the family was heartbroken. Savannah appeared to have been crying. Her siblings looked equally devastated. Possibly they were in shock and overwhelmed by what had just happened. No one expects their mother, especially at that age, to go missing and cannot be found quickly and without a trace. So we moved into week 2. Now, week 2 really started to change the tone of the investigation for a while because there were ransom notes and early search efforts. This was kind of a beginning of a chaotic period in the case because I think in the first week, most people thought, okay, that's really sad, that's really tragic, but we're going to find her. She may or may not be alive. But in the second week, ransom notes started appearing in the media, and oddly enough, they were going to one of the places being TMZ. TMZ is primarily an entertainment news outlet, and they typically cover celebrity news, which may be why they were brought into this case from a ransom note. They typically cover entertainment stories and pop culture, but they reported that they had received ransom notes connected to the Nancy Guthrie case and that those notes had been sent specifically to them and possibly a few other media outlets. As you can imagine, there was a lot of skepticism about this. When I was researching and following the case during the early days, there were a lot of people questioning whether the ransom notes were legitimate at all. Some people were even saying TMZ just fabricated this for publicity. Now, I don't know if that's true, and frankly, I doubt it. But what seems more likely is that someone sent hoax ransom notes to TMZ, knowing they would publish them quickly, because that's the type of lane they report on in TMZ. But authorities did later identify at least one person connected to a host communication, and I believe that individual was eventually arrested. I don't know what happened at the time. After that. But at the time, it created a huge amount of confusion about what was real and what wasn't. And there were a lot of people saying, wait, we've got a ransom note. Why aren't we putting out money? Why isn't the family putting out money? But the ransom notes themselves were strange. They demanded payment for Nancy's return, but what really stood out was the way the deadlines were written. The note reportedly said something along the lines of, bring the money by February 5th, and if that isn't possible, bring it by February 9th, but the amount would increase. If you've ever looked into any kidnapping cases or ransom demands, you know that's not usually how it works. Ransom notes typically give very strict instructions and a single deadline. They don't usually give alternate deadlines like someone scheduling a bill payment. The structure of these notes actually reminded me of ransomware attacks, where the hackers lock up a company or government servers and they demand payment. And in those cases, the demand might say something like, pay $2 million now, and if you don't pay, the amount increases. And we won't unlock this until you pay. And that makes sense in a cybercrime context. But in a kidnapping situation involving a human life, that kind of flexibility is unusually, it's just really random. It just doesn't make sense. And it raised a lot of questions about whether the notes were authentic at all. During this time, Nancy's daughter, Savannah, responded publicly to the ransom notes. She made statements saying that the family had heard the demands, that they were listening, and that they were willing to do whatever it was to bring Nancy home. But they also said they needed proof of life. And that request is extremely common in kidnapping cases. Before a family pays ransom, investigators are going to advise family members and others involved in the case to confirm that the victim is still alive, because in many cases, that's simply not the case. And by this point, it was very clear that federal authorities were heavily involved. The FBI often assists in kidnapping investigations, and partly because the cases can quickly cross state lines. But it's important to know that kidnapping itself doesn't automatically become a federal crime unless the victim is transported across state lines. But local law enforcement frequently will invite the FBI because they want their assistance. They've got specialized experience in these types of crimes. From everything we can tell, the FBI was actively working alongside local investigators, although that's not what was reported in the media. Many times it was reported that the FBI was asked to leave, that the FBI was trying to take it over. That's simply not what the FBI does. And this is coming from many FBI resources and many local investigators across the state saying that's just not how it works. So officials have been really tight-lipped about the details of who's involved. But one thing investigators did confirm during week 2 was that the blood found on Nancy's porch was hers. There was a significant development in that because it confirmed that some type of violent struggle had likely taken place at the home. Around this time, the surveillance footage also began circulating more widely, and people were analyzing the video frame by frame. They were trying to determine everything about the suspect, whether the person appeared young or old, whether they were by themselves, whether they were male or possibly female, and even focusing on small details like the subject's facial hair. Some observers claimed the suspect appeared to have a mustache, and they even noted there seemed to be a small gap between the mustache and the upper lip. It was this level of detail people were really honing into. Even professionals, former detectives and analysts, started weighing in online with their interpretation of the video. There were people doing body language studies. Meanwhile, investigators were conducting very thorough property searches around Nancy's home. During this time, a number of journalists, a number of journalists and independent investigators were setting up outside the property. If you watched anything online, you noticed that there were a large number of reporters like Brian Enton from News Nation, and he deserves some credit for consistently reporting updates on this case. But there were also YouTubers that were covering the case, like JLR Investigates, who was regularly documenting activity around the house. He also was going on searches and walking around and speaking to people. Now, I don't know whether having that many cameras around helps or hurts the investigation, so I'm not going to, lay blame to anybody for doing this or say, hey, it's great. But one thing it does do is it gives the public a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground. And because people were documenting things, we were able to see some of the search efforts investigators were conducting. And authorities searched the backyard, a septic tank, and a manhole located behind the home. When people first heard about the septic tank and the manhole, there was some confusion. They were asking, why would investigators even search those locations? Nancy obviously would not have climbed into something like that herself. But the investigators weren't necessarily looking for a person. They could have been searching for evidence. They might have been searching for a weapon, for bloody clothing, for anything discarded or left behind. Anything that was discarded after the crime. In some cases, investigators will check plumbing systems to look for blood and other biological evidence that may have washed away, so that these searches may look unusual, but they're actually part of a larger investigative plan. And we know from other cases that sometimes these do lead to evidence. If you think of the backyard searches that were done in the Lori Vallow case, where they found the children's bodies on the Daybell property, on Chad Daybell properties. Every time I think of them, I can't think of their names right off. I just think the crazy people, because they were just so out there and horribly, horribly violent. So they could be searching for evidence. And they also can be searching for unusual things, disturbed ground, or anything like that. Another development during week 2 was the involvement of Border Patrol resources. Now, I'm going to take a minute and talk about this because Border Patrol deployed tracking dogs and specialized equipments like drones to assist in the search. And a lot of people were really upset about Border Patrol being involved because they associated their involvement with something that related to customs and ICE. I saw a lot of that online, but that's not what they were there for. And it should be noted that Border Patrol often assists law enforcement officers and detectives in searching for missing people, in searching for things in the desert, because they've got high-tech drones that can be used. So a lot of people don't realize that they have extremely advanced equipment. They've got tactical gear designed for searching difficult terrain like deserts and wilderness areas. So this is a really big help. And because of that, they're frequently called in to assist with searches, in places like Arizona, California, and other areas where large open terrain makes searches really difficult. Because think about it, if you are having to do all of that on foot, you've got a lot of dangers in those areas. You've got rattlesnakes. You've got poisonous spiders. You've got scorpions. And that is not to mention holes and cactus plants that will hurt you if you just brush up against them or get close to them. So there's a lot of dangerous things in the environment itself out in a desert area. So if a drone can do it and look in that area, quickly, methodically mapping back and forth, it can save people a lot rather than them having to go out on foot. The involvement with border control in this case had absolutely nothing to do with immigration enforcement or anyone over in Mexico. That is what everyone seems to indicate from the only official sources that we have, because they're not giving regular press conferences. Now, meanwhile, the tip line was absolutely flooded. Investigators were receiving thousands of tips, and while some of those may have been helpful, some of them weren't, because you're going to have your nutcases that call in and just want to get attention. And that's the reality of high-profile cases, unfortunately. For every good lead investigators receive, there are often dozens of tips that turn out to be, maybe misunderstanding, speculation, or sometimes just people inserting themselves into the case. Unfortunately, detectives still have to sort through every single one of those in order to make sure they don't miss something important. And by the end of week 2, the case had already become national news, and public attention was growing rapidly. This was also the time when people began bringing flowers and memorial items to Nancy's home. And it was also the point where online speculation started turning heavily towards members of Nancy's family. In particular, some people began focusing on her daughter Annie, as well as Annie's partner. He might be a fiance, might be a husband, I'm not quite sure, but Tommaso. And there were a lot of accusations being thrown around online. But it's important to remember that none of these accusations were supported by any evidence, and law enforcement has since said that the family was cleared. There's been a lot of speculation online about that from former detectives, about why in the world are you saying the family's cleared when you just got finished saying no one's cleared. So I don't know if it was pressure. We don't really know because we don't know the inside, or if someone just spoke out of turn. But at that point, the only reason people were focusing on them was because they were the last people known to have seen Nancy alive. And being the last person to see someone does not mean you're responsible for what happened However, as we know in the true crime world, it often does lead to the person that was responsible for the crime. So the speculation continued, and um, I want to talk about something about the tips real quick. They were getting so many tips, but remember that even though they have to go through all of those tips, it's important to acknowledge that sometimes tips can be covered up by the sheer volume of tips. And we've seen that in a number of cases. We've seen that in cases where people have called in information and it got vetted, but it really didn't get attached to anything. One of the most famous of those was the Green River Killer and Ted Bundy. Many people called in both of those individuals, especially Bundy, but law enforcement did a pass over him and said, no, there's no way it can be him. Same with Ridgway. So, and they're just two of them. There's been a number of this in cases. So it is going to happen. You're going to have people that are called in that ultimately are the right person. You know, when that video surfaced, there's going to be people calling in saying, you know what, I recognize that walk. I recognize that person. I recognize those eyes. But sometimes that's all you have. And if that's all law enforcement has, there's not really anything else they can do until more comes along, and maybe they review that again later. So it doesn't mean they don't have the right tip. It just means it hasn't been lined up yet. So in week 3, I don't think anybody expected the investigation to be where it was. I think most people believed, I did for sure, that within a couple of weeks at the most, there would have been some major breakthrough. Either she would have been found or investigation would have, found some sort of suspect. But instead, week 3 just brought more questions than answers, and more people moving to the street where Nancy lived and camping out. And one of the developments during this time involved additional surveillance footage. Investigators reported there was a video showing a vehicle speeding away near the time of Nancy's disappearance. But we don't have a lot of information about that vehicle. They haven't confirmed her description, no clear timeline, and no indication of whether investigators believe it's truly connected to the crime. I don't know why they would not release that, because it was the release of that information that led to Brian Kohberger. They had other information as well, but that vehicle was instrumental. So I'm not quite sure if they don't believe this is involved, if that's just a rumor, or why they haven't released it. Another development was the detention of a man in Rio Rico. Now, they detained him as part of the investigation, but he was released without any charges. And after he was arrested, you may have seen on the news, there was a woman who identified herself as his mother, but I think she was actually his mother-in-law. And she spoke to reporters about how there was no possible way he could have been involved. She said he'd been with the family and that the accusations made absolutely no sense. And after they released him, the man himself spoke publicly about the experience several times. Investigators have made it clear there's nothing linking him to the case, and no charges were filed. We don't know what led them to him because we haven't been given that information. So one of the things that's rather sad about this is that after his arrest, he's talked on the news regularly about how this has affected him. He's had people threatening him, following him, stalking him. It's deeply affected his life. And in that sense, I can understand why maybe the investigators are not releasing other people of interest, because as much as people want to help in the true crime world, many times there's people out there that just insert themselves and make it really, really difficult. There's been other cases that we've seen a lot of that happen. Summer Wells case, Maura Murray, Sebastian Rogers. Everybody wants to bring the people home, and everybody wants answers. So what happens is people, whether they mean harm or not, are convinced that someone is responsible or someone knows something. And maybe that person truly is a victim of the circumstances themselves. Maybe that person had nothing to do with it. And people are chased around, and life online is made miserable. Many of these people's addresses are given out, they're doxxed, and it can be fatal for someone if the wrong person is chasing after them, convinced that they hurt someone. So we don't know what led them to this, but we do know he's not linked to the case. No charges were filed. And we don't know what pointed them in his direction. Something must have, and it could have been a tip. And we don't know. We've not been given that information. But meanwhile, investigators continued processing the forensic evidence collected from the home. They were testing hair samples, blood evidence, skin cells, and mixed DNA samples. This is standard procedure in a case like this, especially where there are signs of struggle. We aren't told exactly what went on in that home. But during week 3, something else really began to intensify, and that was the online public criticism of the investigation. It really got ugly. There had been some criticism in week 2, but not really. It really started to ramp up in week 3, particularly online. A lot of that discussion happened on YouTube, where several former detectives, homicide investigators, and cold case specialists began analyzing the case. And these weren't just random commentators. These are, many of them, people raising questions, had decades of investigative experience. Many were retired detectives. Many were former homicide detectives. Others worked specially on missing persons or cold case units. Their biggest concern centered around how the crime scene was handled in the early hours of the investigation. And their concerns were, why wasn't the entire neighborhood immediately locked down once blood was discovered at the scene? Why wasn't the home locked down and stayed locked down? Why were so many people allowed to come in and out of that neighborhood, up her driveway? Why was there a pizza delivery person allowed to come to her door? Why, one of the other questions was whether the search warrants were obtained quickly enough. And perhaps the biggest concern was whether the entire crime scene itself may have been contaminated. A lot of these online investigators pointed out that people appeared to have been allowed in and out of the house early on, possibly including family members, even after blood had been discovered on the porch, and that is very concerning. There were also questions about physical evidence outside the home. For example, some observers noticed there was a welcome mat on the porch, and it appeared to remain in place, and it should have been taken for potential evidence. There were also reports of tracks that appeared to lead toward the garage, which raised questions about whether someone may have entered or exited through that area. Now, I think it's been determined that that's possibly where she was dropped off, or they parked to walk her in on that Saturday evening that she went missing. So I think that might have been cleared up. But again, the critics were arguing that, all of this should have been researched and should have had investigators combing over it. And the critics were saying that once blood was discovered and there were signs of a struggle, everything should have remained secured from the very beginning. Now, to be fair, there's an important factor we have to keep in mind. We are not inside the investigation, and although these people online are former investigators, former homicide detectives, and many of them are at the top of their game, and many of them have names that are renowned in the industry, they are not inside the investigation either. So it may be that things happened that they are not aware of. And they just may not have the information that, and so they're saying, this is what we would have done. We didn't see this happen. We should have seen this happen, and this is not how you do it. And this is going to be a problem for defense attorneys when they find someone. That's largely what I'm hearing. And, I can understand that. For example, if detectives determined early on that what happened inside the house was a homicide rather than a kidnapping, that will change how the entire investigation steps were handled, but we won't necessarily know that. I hate to even say that out loud, but it's a possibility that investigators started from that point and we don't know it. And if they believed from the beginning that she'd been killed inside her home, their investigation approach would look very different than what we think. And it would look different from if they believed she'd been taken alive and could still be rescued. But because we're not inside the investigation, we just really don't know what investigators saw inside the home. Another criticism that's been circulating online, starting with this week, week 3, was how information was being communicated to the public. A lot of commentators, and I know some police officers personally myself, who have stated that the sheriff should not have been acting as the primary spokesperson. There should have been a public information officer, which is commonly called a PIO. The officers that I know personally have said, you never have the top dog updating the press and updating the public that way. You need to have somebody that's got that specialized training to do it. In many departments, especially high-profile investigations, a PIO almost always handles media briefings, so investigators can just focus on the case. And usually the top people, like the sheriff or the police chief or whatever, typically worries about managing the command staff and, unfortunately, handling the politics that are always going to be present in a case like this. So it's somewhat unusual, though not unheard of, that the sheriff or the chief would personally deliver so many of the updates. And, that's another complaint. People are always saying there's a lack of regular updates. Typically, in a case of this magnitude, you will have regular updates. You'll have a PIO coming out and saying, hey, on Tuesday, we're going to do a 2 o'clock update. Hey, on Thursday, we're going to do it, whatever. But that's not happening. So there's a lot of people feeling really disconcerted about this case. And the reality is that investigators don't really owe us public constant updates. They really don't owe it to us. Their responsibility is to the victim and the victim's family. And if releasing certain information could jeopardize the investigation, they may choose to hold that information back. We know that almost every investigation has some holdback information. Now, like many people following the case, I personally prefer to have more information than less. But at the same time, we've got to remember that the investigators are still working an active case, and they may not feel like there's a point right now where they can release anything. Sometimes silence means they are protecting something important. We've seen cases many times. Think back to when we think nothing's happening and then bam, there's a break in the case. So by the end of week 3, the investigation had reached a strange place. Detectives were still processing evidence, still following leads, and still receiving tips. But public frustration was growing and turning on them. Meanwhile, online commentators, YouTube channels, and news media outlets remained camped out in front of the home. And many of them were going back and forth between the home and Annie's home. Before I move into week 4, I do want to mention one thing. They did take I meant to mention this in week 1. They did remove a vehicle from Annie and Tomas's house. And that caused a lot of discussion online. Detectives online were saying you don't remove and hold on to a vehicle for a month or more when there's nothing to come through. You go through the vehicle, you put it back together, and then you give it back, unless there was some reason. We don't have a lot of information about that. So I don't know. I have not been able to confirm from official sources whether it has been given back or they still have it. I heard one news source say they were told that the vehicle was put back together and given back. I heard another one just this week say they're still working on reassembling the vehicle to give back to the family. So I don't really know. But now we move into week 4. And at this point, the media presence is still very large. There's still reporters, independent investigators, YouTubes, really a mix of people all gathered in the area trying to follow the case. Some of them were simply stationed outside the house, waiting to see what investigators would do next so they could report on it. Others were actively searching areas themselves, hoping they might stumble onto something that had been overlooked. Some reporters were driving back and forth between Nancy's home and Annie's home, trying to see who might be there. There was just a lot happening, and the truth is everyone wanted to be the person that helped solve the case. And the public often helps by giving tips, but it's usually not the online community that solves cases. But during week 4, something important happened on the law enforcement side. They began refocusing their resources and shifting the case to a smaller investigative team. At first glance, this can sound concerning. When people hear they're scaling down, they sometimes, say, well, they've given up, they're losing momentum. But I don't think that's the case. From everything that I've looked at and listening to former detectives and just watching what's going on, it sounds to me like investigators started off collecting everything and searching. They're searching for answers. They're searching for clues. They're searching for her. They're searching for the suspect. They're collecting evidence. They're collecting camera evidence, phone evidence. But at some point, they've got to go back and say, let's look at everything we searched, collected, videoed, and everything we've got. And let's look at our results of our canvassing, our results of the interviews. Let's look at the tips. And because everybody can't be doing everything at once. So you might have 400 plus investigators, but most of them might be out collecting information because time is of the essence when you are looking for someone. But now, after a period of time, or maybe there was something that happened and shifted it, they bring it all back and say, we've got to start running down the leads. We've got to process the tips. We've got to go out and interview more witnesses. And we've got to start combing through it and analyzing everything we've collected and going back to those people that need to be talked to again. So in other words, they have to stop gathering at some point for the most part. They'll never stop looking long enough to actually study what they've collected. So the idea behind shifting to a smaller team is that a group of detectives can now focus intensely on the evidence. This is where they're going to bring in specialized people that they might have already brought in, but now they're going to really provide them with everything they've got and say, we've got to put pieces of this together. It also, and I've learned this from detectives, both that I know and from my research and listening and watching, there may be something that was found. And that is a key, not necessarily the key, but a key to putting all the rest of the pieces in place to go after the next warrants that they need. So investigators have emphasized that DNA evidence had not yet matched anyone other than confirming Nancy's own DNA at the scene. They confirmed there's still no suspect and there's no confirmed vehicle connected to the crime, despite the surveillance footage that showed one speeding away. People don't understand that the investigators can't be everywhere at once, I think. And that I'm not saying that they're doing everything right because I've never been an investigator or a homicide detective. I don't know any of that. That is not anything that I ever wanted to be a part of. But authorities have responded by saying that hundreds of personnel are still involved in the case, but the investigation has simply moved into a different phase. And during week 4, investigators began publicly discussing several possible theories about what might have happened: a kidnapping, a targeted account, or someone familiar with the home. Well, those are things that, are sort of obvious from day one. We know from day one it might have been a kidnapping, it might have been a targeted account, and it might have been someone familiar with the home. So that's sort of one of those things fairly obvious from the beginning. After all, if someone entered Nancy's home in the middle of the night, that suggests a certain level of knowledge about the property and her routine, and it's possible that investigators have been considering these possibilities from the start and simply chose week 4 to publicly acknowledge them. But it almost feels like every week had a different emotional tone. Week 1 was shock. People believed she'd be found quickly. Week 2 brought intense activity and a sense that, we've got something here. She's not been found. There's a major problem. And this sense that investigators were closing in on answers. Week 3, nope, we don't have anything. I'm frustrated. There's criticism. That's how people were feeling. I'm frustrated about it, and I'm critiquing everything they do. In week 4, people were realizing this case might be far more complicated than anybody initially thought. And Nancy had serious health issues. Remember, she had a pacemaker, and the device is no longer transmitting data. She had medication. She probably didn't have that medication with her. They probably didn't say, let's pack up her medication and everything she needs, unless it was truly someone that knew her very well and it was for ransom purposes, because otherwise, why would you keep her alive? If something had frightened her, if she'd woke suddenly and she encountered someone inside her home, it's possible that the shock alone triggered some type of medical emergency. Investigators have said that Nancy was taken from her bed, though the exact evidence behind that conclusion has not been fully explained, or at least I've not found it, but I have heard that commented several times. And if that is accurate, it suggests that she may have been asleep when the intruder entered her home, or maybe she was in bed reading and didn't have her hearing aids in. And if she woke up suddenly to find someone there, that could have caused extreme stress, particularly for someone with health conditions. And that possibility has led people to speculate that maybe she suffered a medical crisis during the event, but investigators have never confirmed that. And another interesting shift in public perception also began around week 4. Early on, people looked at the suspect seen in the surveillance video and assumed the person must be, not very sophisticated, just by watching the mannerisms. The way the gun was held is what was communicated. Going and picking up flowers and trying to shove them in the camera. But by week 4, people were saying, I don't know. Despite the video evidence and the massive investigation, the suspect still hasn't been identified. So if this person wasn't careful or intelligent, how did they manage to avoid being caught for 4 weeks? And then we moved into week 5. And this is where investigators appeared to find what could have been an important piece of evidence. Now, it was during this week, investigators discovered black gloves near the scene, or we became aware of it during this week. At first, this seemed like, this is really significant because they look similar to the gloves worn by the masked suspect that was in the surveillance video, right? And investigators collected the gloves and they sent them for forensic testing, but when they came back, it turns out they belonged to a nearby restaurant worker. And once investigators followed up, they determined that the gloves were not at all connected to the case. So when you think about it, that explanation makes sense. People who work in restaurants or food delivery will often wear disposable gloves, and it wouldn't be unusual for someone to remove them, and maybe they dropped them, or maybe they discarded them purposely. But once the news about the gloves went public, more and more black gloves started appearing in the area. It was the strangest thing. It's like, where are all these coming from, and why were they missed? They wouldn't have all been missed by law enforcement. Some were found near the home, some were found further away. And it led me to think, well, people were just planting these gloves intentionally to get some notoriety. Not all of them, but some of them. And sometimes in high profile cases, people will insert themselves into the investigation for attention or because they think it will be fun to do. It's not, and don't. Whatever the reason, none of the gloves that have been found so far have led investigators to anything closer to identifying the person seen in the video or who might have been in Nancy's home that night. Meanwhile, investigators are continuing to work through DNA evidence. They're starting to explore genetic genealogy testing. This is the same type of technology that's been used to identify suspects in cold cases. I think the Golden State Killer, I think they used it in Brian Kohberger's. And if investigators were able to obtain usable DNA from the scene, like if there was a struggle or a fight or something, genetic genealogy could potentially help them identify relatives of whoever left that DNA behind. At the same time, online speculation continued to grow. The investigation had entered a stage where there were fewer visible developments, which often leads to more speculation and rumors. And the other major development is that investigators began preparing to return Nancy's home to the family. And as you can imagine, this really got people in an uproar because people believed that if the home was no longer an active crime scene, it was now then a cold case. But once it began to be returned to the family, many of the people who had been camping outside moved on. Now, there's still a few people who remained. News Nation has stayed. Some of the YouTubers have stayed. There's a couple of other local news agencies that have stayed. And I think from watching it every day, they've done a pretty good balance of they've done a pretty good job of trying to balance respect for the family's privacy and with the possibility that something could happen in the investigation, and they don't want to miss that. They want to report on that. I think most of the people that are coming now and staying there now understand that they're probably not going to be the ones to break the case. They might be the one to report a break. But I think earlier on, some of them, especially some of the YouTubers, were thinking there might be something they could find that they could alert media to, alert the alert the police and investigators to, that might not only make the news, but also break the case. Okay, so now, returning the home to the family usually means investigators believe that they've collected all the evidence they need from the scene. Ideally, that means that investigators, including the FBI, have thoroughly processed the property and left no stone unturned. Keep in mind something. I want you to think about your own house. Investigators don't know where you keep your personal things that might lead to something. They don't know if someone keeps a journal hidden on a bookshelf, or notes tucked inside a drawer, or important papers inside a book, or personal notes inside a Bible. There can be hundreds of places where useful information might be hidden. Maybe somebody's written in a journal about seeing somebody suspicious outside their home, but they've never told anyone for whatever reason. Maybe they've just never told anyone. That is the kind of information that investigators can use in an investigation of this type. But it takes a long time to go through everything. And they've got to go through carefully and determine what might be relevant and what really can be just returned back to the rest of the family. And one thing that's been made notable through this investigation is the way Nancy's family has handled the situation publicly. Aside from their pleas for help and their statements asking for information and the information about, giving, the family gave $1 million reward and offering to make donations to places. The family has not been highly vocal in the media. They've not publicly criticized investigators at all that I'm aware of. And they've not yet announced that they're conducting their own independent investigation. They appear to be working patiently with law enforcement. But when you consider someone like Savannah Guthrie, who clearly has significant connections and resources, she's been a journalist for a long time. It's reasonable to assume that if the family believed the investigation was not being handled properly or not being handled on a timely manner, they would have brought in their own investigation team. You can imagine that people have offered their services to her because of the line of business that she's in and because of her notoriety. But at least at this point, we've had no indication that the family has chosen to go that route. So they seem to be having faith in what law enforcement is doing. That's the way it appears. Let's see, what else? What else do we have that was in that week? Okay, so the other things we had people that were continuing to criticize about the gloves, people that were, there's a lot of criticism in this case, it just continues on and on. Now, I have noticed many channels have moved on and they're not talking about it as much. They're only covering it when something happens. I wanted to give a 6-week recap because that's where we are, because there's no way to follow every single thing that was happening in this case at the time it was happening without being online all day, every day. Let's see what else we've got. There were a lot of people still analyzing the surveillance video, trying to determine, oh yeah, this was a big thing. A lot of people felt like the surveillance video actually showed 2 different nights. And I believe someone in law enforcement actually made that statement, that it was 2 nights. Might have been the FBI that said that. I'm not quite sure, but someone stated it was 2 separate nights and that they could tell that for one reason because of not only the clothing difference in the clothing, but also because one photo had the moon reflection and it was well lit up, and the other one, the moon clearly was not out like that. I don't know if that's the case. Others have said that the difference are just explained by lighting and shadows, depending on where the cameras were positioned. There's been a lot of speculation that 2 individuals might have been involved, and that possibility raises another thing to think about. Because if someone enters Nancy's home and removes her from her property, it'd be extremely difficult for that person to just do it alone. They would have to just pick her up, throw her over her shoulder, and walk out the desert. So I think there's got to be a vehicle certainly involved. And it's unlikely that they just carried her long distances, which leads to another mystery. Where is the vehicle footage? In almost every neighborhood, there are multiple cameras. I mean, in my neighborhood now, everybody pretty much has got a camera. So I can't imagine a neighborhood like this where it's high dollar, much higher dollars than those around it. They wouldn't have cameras. And where is the vehicle footage? That's something I don't understand. But none of that footage has been released. So then we entered this week. And it became obvious that the investigators are no longer actively using cadaver dogs in the search. And they've indicated that they still believe Nancy could be alive. Now that's great news. That is great news, but we don't know what information have caused them to believe that. We also heard that Savannah Guthrie is planning to return to her job. We don't have a date yet, but apparently she did go on the Today Show. She considers her coworkers very close to her. Many of them are like family to her. They consider her family, and they are very excited to have her come back. They're very supportive in this entire situation. So that brought about a lot of speculation, because a lot of people feel, well, if she's going back to work, she's not out there anymore, which means she doesn't believe that her mom is alive, or she would never leave that place. Well, we don't know that. We don't know that. So we don't have confirmed search areas now. And we have investigators that have indicated that Nancy may have been moved out of the region entirely. Earlier in the investigation, officials stated that somewhere between 300 and 400 investigators were assigned to the case at different points, and that tens of thousands of tips have been reviewed. So imagine how many, if that's been reviewed or received even, imagine the manpower it's going to take to go through a lot of those, because you can't just discard a lot of them right off the bat. And a lot of the information is coming from a mix of sources: traditional media outlets like News Nation, articles from publications like New York Post, and journalists who have constantly been reporting from the scene. Some reporters have really stayed in the trenches on this case. They've been talking to neighbors, speaking with sources close to the investigation, and gathering what information they can. A good journalist knows how to approach people, how to ask the right questions, how to piece together information that helps the public better understand what's happening. At the same time, there's been independent YouTubers covering the case. Now, someone that I mentioned before is JLR Investigates, for example. He's not a traditional journalist in the same sense as someone like Brian Enton from News Nation. But he and others like him have still played a role in keeping this case visible. And love him or hate him, that visibility is important. When hundreds of thousands of people are watching coverage every day, it increases the chances that the right person might see something and recognize it. Sometimes someone will assume that a tip hasn't come in by now, that it probably never will, but that's not necessarily true. When investigators are receiving thousands and thousands of tips, it takes time to go through them all. And sometimes the tip that breaks the case is buried somewhere in the middle of that stack. And we talked about before that, no matter how the tips are coming in, that volume is going to take a while to get through. And some things are going to have to say, wait a minute, I remember something, and it'll be something that's stuck in their mind, and they've got to go find that. And we've seen it happen where someone calls in a tip about a suspicious person, and something unusual they saw, and that information isn't immediately recognized for what it is. Only later, when investigators circle back and review everything again in totality, do they realize that one piece of information may have been the key all along. So while it may look like nothing's happening publicly, that doesn't mean nothing's happening behind the scenes. And it doesn't mean it's a cold case. And there's another factor here that we should probably acknowledge. When someone as high profile as Savannah Guthrie, who's a nationally known journalist and co-host of the Today Show, you can absolutely be certain that investigators understand the level of attention this case has received. They understand the scrutiny. That doesn't mean the case would be ignored otherwise, but it does mean that there's a lot of pressure and a lot of scrutiny surrounding the investigation. So it's extremely unlikely that this case would be abandoned for that reason alone. Investigators are almost certainly still working on it and just not passing along information. And as we reach the end of this episode, there's still several major questions that I want to bring to light. One, was this a targeted kidnapping? There's several things that suggest that it might have been. The backpack, he appeared to be prepared. The cameras were disabled. If the individual was carrying a backpack, which would have been used, if Let me back up. The individual was carrying a backpack, but we don't know what was in the backpack. And if the backpack was being carried to have those tools of kidnapping, maybe a tarp to carry her in, anything along those lines, that would indicate that they had prepared. The suspects seemed to understand where cameras were located and how to approach the home. Well, I say that, but then that one appeared to not know for sure that there was a camera that worked there. So is it perhaps that the person knew there was a camera there, but was given information from someone that the camera was not active? And maybe that person thought not syncing up to the cloud meant it wasn't active. But in reality, the camera was active. It just wasn't syncing up to the cloud. I mean, that's just something to think about, because if they were aware of this, they either cased the place out or someone educated them on it. And that someone would be someone that's been there before. The suspect also did not seem to use any forced break-in methods. That raises again the possibility that the person may have known something about the home's layout or Nancy's routine. And if you don't have a forced entry and you have someone that seems to know where things are, that tells you a lot right there. And I'm sure the investigators have even more that tells them things. Then there's the question about the ransom notes. In most kidnapping cases involving ransom demand, there's usually ongoing communications between the kidnappers and either the victim's family or police, law enforcement. But in this case, there's been no confirmed follow-up communication that we have been told. And it's still unclear whether the original ransom messages were legitimate at all. Another possibility that investigators may have considered is whether the suspect might be local. Someone familiar with the area would know the routes in and out of the neighborhood, understanding the timing of the activity, and be aware of camera placements along the route. I think it's highly probable that the suspect is local. I think it's highly probable that it's someone that knew her routine, had come to her home before, maybe someone who was at one point in her home working or cleaning or doing something, a skilled worker of some sort, and then spoke to another friend, and that friend said, you used to work over there. I bet there's money. Let's go do this or that or the other. It's highly possible that that is something that happened. It seems like that would be broken quite early, but we don't know how sophisticated those people are. So 6 weeks into this investigation, here we are. No arrest, no confirmed suspect, and no confirmed location of Nancy Guthrie. And cases like this are going to hinge usually on one critical piece of evidence. It could be that security camera clip. It could be a phone signal. It could be someone recognizing the backpack, or the way the person walks, or the way their body moves. Sometimes it's the smallest detail that breaks a case wide open. And that's one of the reasons that we continue to talk about these types of cases on our show. Not just because they're out there and because they're true crime. And it's not just this case. There's many missing person cases happening across the country. Because somewhere, someone often knows something. Someone may recognize the person in the video. Someone may recognize who that individual is, recognize the clothing, the way they walk. One tip can make a difference. And if you have any information related to this case, please report it to the appropriate authorities. And thank you for listening to Case by Case.